Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I am the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I am incredibly honored to share this space today with incredible speakers and an incredible audience coming together to talk about this important topic of human trafficking awareness and prevention. Thank you all for being here as speakers, and thank you all for being here in our audience. And more importantly, thank you all for the work that you do in this space. It is unbelievably important, and without you, so many folks, so many survivors would not receive the help that they need. So with that being said, welcome to Best Practices for Legal Professionals when working with survivors of human trafficking. This is part of a human trafficking awareness and prevention series that we developed, and this is the third and final installment of that series. And I say that just to also remind everyone that this is an ongoing conversation. Just because the month of January is, rearing towards an end, doesn't mean that we don't keep talking about this and talking about this awareness and prevention. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for continuing that conversation throughout the rest of our years as we go forward. I'd like to thank the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking as a co-sponsor to this event. Not only co-sponsoring, but really working to curate the speakers that we have here today, who are unbelievably knowledgeable in all aspects of the fields and the areas impacted by human trafficking. A couple of just housekeeping announcements. This was approved for CLE credit. CLE by the Florida Bar, Continuing Education for Lawyers. So what I will do is I will put that CLE information into the chat towards the end of our conversation. I will also follow up with you all via email. You'll receive an email from Zoom with this information, a copy of this recording and the CLE information. But I will also put my email into the chat. You can reach out to me directly if you don't see that in your inbox or you need anything. The other announcement that I wanted to give is Natasha Nascimento with Redefining Refuge was unable to be with us today. She's under the weather, but we have Celeste Williams, who is a youth and family advocate for Redefining Refuge, here in her place. And I think the final piece of housekeeping announcements I wanted to make is that this is really going to be a conversation. There's not going to be a PowerPoint. There's not going to be, something like that. So I wanted to encourage you all to up in the corner, there's a little button that says view. You might want to click that view button and go down to gallery view. That way you can see everybody on your screen. If anyone has any technological issues or just needs some help, please feel free to message me directly, and I'll do everything I can in the virtual sphere to get you where you want to be. And so with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Coonan, who is going to not only be one of our speakers, but our moderator, and move this along. Thank you very much, everybody. And I will be right here if you need anything additional.
Good. Thank you, Alexis, and welcome to all of you. Welcome, first of all, to a great panel, some quite distinguished people in our Florida anti-trafficking field that are joining us today. As Alexis said, for a conversation about best practices. What are best practices in working with survivors of human trafficking, whether that's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, human trafficking of adults, or very importantly, human trafficking of minors. The three panelists that are our featured panelists are so important. We say in the human rights field that in general, human rights are too important to be left to the lawyers of the world. As a human rights lawyer, I'm a firm believer in that. And the same is true of human trafficking, that it's far too important to be left to the lawyers alone, that lawyers have an incredibly privileged role to play in combating trafficking, whether that's investigating it, whether it is policy work, or very importantly, doing hands-on advocacy work with survivors. So we'll touch on what are some of those best practices, and we'll ask really our specialists in the field, Dr. Toal, Savannah Parvu, and Celeste Williams, to talk to us about their respective areas of expertise, where it is that they work in collaboration with folks in the legal field, and what is it that they want lawyers and legal professionals to know about that. As Alexis mentioned, this is another installment of the Florida Legal Services January Training Services. I know we've previously looked at human trafficking, how to identify and report it, legal avenues to provide protection to human trafficking survivors, and I thought a very important session on expunging the records of human trafficking survivors here in Florida. Like I said, we bring a really, really diverse group of professionals to the table to educate those of us who are attorneys about their expertise in trafficking, what we can learn from them. Let me start out, if I could, asking Celeste Williams, tell us a little bit about your background and the area of your work in the anti-trafficking field here in Florida.
Hi, thanks, Terence. It's Celeste Williams, and I work with Redefining Refuge. So we provide advocacy, targeted case management to victims of trafficking, juvenile victims. Our program goes up to the age of 18, and then we typically make referrals out to our, other similar programs that extend beyond the age of 18. We're also the human trafficking liaison for our foster care agency, CNHC. Again, so we provide advocacy and targeted case management. Many of our youth are in foster care. We also have community youth. So we do a lot of advocacy in the court system. So I'm typically working with lawyers, with probation officers, ensuring that all the needs of these trauma victims are being met through a lot of them, as we know, have DJJ history, have criminal history. So they're going to be going through this process, and a lot of it is traumatic. It's traumatic being in foster care. It's traumatic going through the legal system. So I think this is obviously very important, that everyone between judges and lawyers, and we're coming from a trauma-centered approach, because as we know, like I said, just being in foster care or going through the criminal justice, the juvenile justice system is traumatic in of itself. So it's important that we recognize things such as triggers, or we recognize what we're doing, and we're not, hindering or not adding to any trauma. So again, that's, we provide advocacy. I meet with the youth, kind of a mentorship capacity. But again, we're doing a lot of our work. I'm in court hearings very frequently, almost every day we're in court hearings. So that's where I come from on my end.
That's great. And your background as literally a direct service provider will be crucial, I think, to this conversation. Let me turn to Savannah Parvu, one of our great survivor advocates here in Florida. Savannah, tell us a little bit about your background, but very importantly about your role in the anti-trafficking field here in Florida.
Yes, so I am a survivor of familial trafficking in Central Florida. I was trafficked off and on between the ages of 11 to 26, and also in the foster care system. But now I speak to raise awareness of human trafficking and help others better assist survivors and victims. And I've done a lot of work with legislation to get laws passed in Florida. And I serve on the board of directors for the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking.
Great. Thank you for that vital work that you do here on behalf of all of us here in Florida. In general, I think one of the most exciting and important new trends in the anti-trafficking field is bringing survivors' voices to the table, whether that's working in prevention, whether it's the work that you've done testifying in front of our legislature has been really important, and keeping the perspective of survivors front and center in all of the work that we do. So thank you for that. And thank you for how you'll bring that to the table with us today, Savannah. Good to see you. Good. And let me turn it over actually to one of the great clinicians in the anti-trafficking field here in Florida, Dr. Philip Toal, to tell us about your background and a little bit of your experience.
Thank you. It's nice to be here today. I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in the state of Florida. My master's is in clinical psychology from the University of Central Florida, and my doctorate is in clinical sexology from the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco. And I've been in the field for 44 years. I work with Aspire Health Partners, which has the only short-term residential treatment program for human trafficking survivors in the state of Florida, and one of the few in the United States that deals directly with bringing survivors into a clinical treatment setting to assist them with the management of trauma. And so I've been working with trauma survivors about 12, 13 years. We initially received some funding for our adolescent program. And while we don't have those dollars for beds, we do have the staff that are continuously trained in working with survivors. But our 10-bed residential, short-term residential program, completely funded by Orange County government. We've been in operation 5 years next month, actually, and probably have served nearly 250 women because it is a program for adult women over the age of 18. So from a clinical standpoint, one point I really like to emphasize, and we'll talk about later, is that this is not short-term treatment. Tending to survivors is a long-term process to really assist them in managing all of the aspects of their experience of sexual exploitation and trafficking in order for them to get or regain the life that all of us so richly deserve. And we need to work very closely with our survivors to assist them in that.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Toal. Your voice will be especially important for legal professionals here in Florida to hear more from. This is, of course, an area, especially the one that you mentioned about trauma, that none of us are trained on in law school. And yet it forms a major part of what we at times are called to do in the legal professional world. So your voice and your experience will, I think, be very important for our legal audience to hear today. I can speak to some degree about how important it is to me as a legal professional to hear the voices of clinicians, to hear the voices of direct service providers and survivor advocates as well. That the human trafficking response or anti-trafficking movement in Florida and nationwide, it's based on a collaborative relationship. I mean, that's at the heart of what we do. And it's just understanding that it's no one legal professional or direct service professional or anyone else that can be the only person to combat and eradicate human trafficking. It requires a whole community of essentially professionals. So that's what I think the great opportunity for this conversation is today, to bring together this group of quite diverse professionals who have a quite diverse portfolio that they can share with us. My own legal background is primarily in victim advocacy. I was initially served in Chile working with torture survivors several decades ago. What I could not have known at that point in time was that what I saw in terms of trauma on the part of torture survivors in a military dictatorship would be equally applicable, and in fact, what I would see now in the work that I do, the legal pro bono work with survivors of human trafficking here in Florida. My own career has primarily been in the area of human rights and immigration law. I direct what's called the Center for the Advancement of Human Rights here at Florida State University, where we provide pro bono legal assistance to survivors of all kinds of violence and human rights violations. We work with asylum seekers, survivors of torture, and very importantly, with survivors of human trafficking as well. That's become a large part of our sort of legal portfolio in the last 20 years. It's led us to do a great deal of policy and research work, a lot of training work. I work training judges, prosecutors, service providers, law enforcement officials, both Florida-wide and nationwide. And very, very importantly, a great deal of policy work with our Florida legislature, our governor's office, and our state agencies. I currently serve on what's called the Florida Statewide Council on Human Trafficking, a group that meets 4 times a year to attempt to identify how is it that our state agencies can better respond to trafficking, whether that's in the investigation and prosecution of cases, or very importantly, in work and care for victims, survivors. So again, it's a privilege for me to get to work in this field, and very, very important part of the human rights field here in Florida. And again, a privilege to join an entire community of professionals statewide that pursue this work. One note for our members of our audience, if you're interested in providing comments or questions, the best way to do that will be to use our chat function. Robin Metcalf Blank from our Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking will be monitoring that chat for me, so that when questions come in, we can ideally work them into the conversation. Hopefully, we'll also have some time near the end for some questions as well. Before we get started, I thought I've been asked just to provide a very, very brief reprise, kind of a summary of the anti-trafficking movement here in Florida. Legally, it began in 2004 when we first implemented statutes against human trafficking. They followed what had occurred at the federal level in 2000 that started with what's called the TVPA, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. That was the landmark legislation that first defined human trafficking, and very importantly noted that those who are victims of human trafficking are to be seen as victims, as survivors, not as anyone violating the law, as an undocumented immigrant, maybe someone engaged in illegal activities such as prostitution. It established what we call the victim-centered paradigm that we have traveled on for much of the last 20 years. Florida followed suit. In 2004, we got our first statutes. We did not see our first prosecution under Florida law for 6 years. It wasn't until 2010 that we saw a prosecution in a state court. Very, very important. We know the law always lags behind the situation on the streets, and this has been the situation with human trafficking here in Florida as well. Very important, our Florida laws took a major step forward in 2012. We passed what's now called our Florida Safe Harbor Law, in which we basically said that children who are encountered in the world of commercial sex need to be treated not as criminals. The law that we passed, we called it our Safe Harbor Law. Initially, it was, I should say, half of a safe harbor law. It basically said to Florida law enforcement, we recommend that you no longer prosecute children for prostitution, and that you instead refer them to DCF. What the law did not do at that point was tell law enforcement here in Florida or prosecutors when might it be appropriate, if ever, to prosecute a child for prostitution. We revisited that in 2016. We basically secured what we now call a true safe harbor law, where in Florida, any child encountered in the world of commercial sex, and again, the work that Celeste does on, I think, almost a daily basis, working with children that are exploited for commercial sex, they are, in fact, trafficking victims by definition. Federal and state law further says that, in general, if it's an adult, they have to show that force, fraud, or some kind of psychological coercion, the hallmarks of trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion, was used against them to either exploit them for commercial sex trafficking, or some other form of labor, anything non-sexual that we call labor trafficking. We continue to see both types of cases here in Florida. Our Human Rights Center tracks a great many of those, as does our Human Trafficking Council. We continue to see quite a few instances of child sex trafficking here in Florida. DCF has done frontline work in terms of both identifying those victims, who they are, where they are, and provided much needed services. DCF has been designated as our lead agency for combining human trafficking. That being said, our other Florida agencies, our Department of Juvenile Justice, our Department of Health, the Office of the Attorney General, Agency for Persons with Disabilities, FDLA, all of them have a very, very important role to actually play in combating trafficking. So when we talk about our response being a collaborative one here in Florida, that very much means a lot of different agencies and a great many different legal professionals as well. Some of the things that we might need to know, our Human Rights Center brought together leaders, both law enforcement and service providers, of our 18 anti-trafficking coalitions and task forces. We were able to do it finally after about 3 years of COVID. We could finally get people together face to face in a room. We did so in Orlando in early May, and we asked them some of the questions that we'll look at today. What are the evolving promising practices in the field, whether for law enforcement, attorneys and prosecutors, or service providers? We also asked them to tell us about trends, and just to give a kind of a quick overview of what are the trends that we're still currently seeing in Florida. Again, we're seeing large sex trafficking cases, at times of foreign national girls and women, but also we see sex trafficking of boys. That is a new trend, both in Florida and in nationwide. It's been going on for years, but just recently recognized as one of our very, very vulnerable victim populations. Given the immigration situation that the United States has faced, much of the immigration in the last 10 years, fear-based immigration, again, who are some of the people fleeing across our southern border? Many of them are children. And that has impacted Florida, the worlds of DCF in particular. These are foreign national children, many of whom are fleeing MS-13. They may be fleeing sexual violence in countries like Mexico or Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. Those are children that make their way to Florida, and that they are on our radar screen. They are very much in need of services, and they represent a distinct population that DCF and a number of stakeholders here in Florida continue to respond to. They're working in agriculture, they're working in construction. We've seen children that are exploited in palmetto berry harvesting, children working in what we call domestic servitude, working as house slaves. We're seeing children and foreign national children in particular that stand very much in need of Florida law enforcement and Florida service providers and legal professionals to understand their situation. In general, we're also seeing an awful lot of sex trafficking of U.S. citizen children. It's about 2008 when we first started to recognize that the largest group of sex trafficking victims in the United States is actually not foreign national girls and women, it's our own U.S. citizen daughters. Oftentimes absent from care, what we used to call runaways, oftentimes combating things like homelessness, substance abuse, at times sexual abuse in their own homes. Many of them find their way into Florida and numerous different venues where we may encounter them as professionals. We're also seeing, of course, a lot of adult sex trafficking and adult labor trafficking as well. We've seen large labor trafficking cases in recent years. One that the federal government just prosecuted very, very well. It's called the Moreno case in South Florida. They prosecuted, it was a massive, massive labor trafficking scheme exploiting, for the most part, foreign national men in our fields here in Florida and 7 other states as well. It involved debt servitude, taking away their documents and working them for very, very long hours, 60, 70 hours a week with very, very little pay. So these are some of the trends that we understand are out there. The other significant trend that's come out is one that DCF has told us about, that a full 77% of the child sex trafficking cases that are verified and that are brought to DCF through our Florida abuse hotline actually do not involve children in our foster care system. They aren't children that are in either foster care homes or group homes. They're rather what we call community children. So these are children still with a supposed caregiver, a family member, it may be an elderly family member or someone, but they're being oftentimes sex trafficked. And we'll especially ask Celeste to talk about the community services, the services available for community children that we now recognize as being one of our largest victim groups, one of the areas of huge vulnerability here in Florida. Some of the other trends that were brought to us was that in the child sex trafficking world in Florida, there oftentimes is very, very little movement. That what we're seeing now is children being exploited. They're being recruited in their own U.S. neighborhoods. They're being exploited by traffickers, pimps, oftentimes in their own neighborhood. And that sadly, the clients, those people who are basically providing the demand side for sex trafficking, are also in their own neighborhoods. So in general, we're trying to continually remind ourselves and others that it's not about movement. Human trafficking is a violation against a person. It's not a movement-based crime, and very important that we recognize it's all in our own backyards here in Florida. It's just kind of a quick overview of what some of the trends and what the law is. If we could, let me go forward now to talk first about language and terminology. Turns out language is very, very important. The language that we use speaks worlds about the services that we provide or the professional roles that we at times actually engage in. For instance, in my own field of immigration, we no longer call people illegal aliens. This recognition that there is no one that's illegal. It may be an undocumented immigrant, but no one by definition is illegal. And that's been an important trend just in terminology in my field. Let me start with Savannah. Savannah, as a survivor mentor, what are some of the examples of language that have occurred to you or to others in our survivor community that are very important for legal professionals to understand or to think about?
Yeah, so I think one of the most common ones is just the difference between victim and survivor. And a lot of times when people are trafficked, they don't realize that they're even a victim of human trafficking. And once they're out of it, they don't want to be considered a victim. But I know in the legal process, you have to have a victim for there to be a case for the correct term. But I think it's important to refer to survivors as survivors, or even ask each individual person how they want you to refer to them when you're speaking to them one-on-one. I know it has to be different in a courtroom, but when you're speaking one-on-one with a person, in order to build that trust in that relationship, it's important to know how they want to be referred to as, whether it's survivor, victim, or even something else. And it's also important to stay away from the term prostituting, because that can also be triggering, and it can also make them feel as if they had a choice or they're at fault in some way.
Those are great examples of kind of evolving notions of how we deal with language. One of the ones that I was introduced to just also in the past year, that to no longer call children that are absent from care runaways. Let's call them children who are absent from care. That I had to add that to my own sort of legal terminology, especially in this world of trying to provide services for children that are at risk. So that for me was a good update in terms of the language that I would use, even in terms of talking about cases or working in the policy world with groups like DCF. Savannah, are there any things that you would recommend to the legal practitioners that we have on this call? What are things that you would want them to include? Are there particular terminology or concepts that I think you've just highlighted some great ones to avoid? Are there ones that they should think more about that they think would be accurate depictions or would tell us about, here's what the survivor community really needs right from the get-go when a legal professional might interact with them?
Yeah, I think a good one to use that a lot of people are okay with is survivor. But another one that I thought of was the difference between, you hear a lot of rescues, and for somebody who's been trafficked, we don't feel like we're being rescued. So a lot of people like the term recovered more than rescued, because when somebody is recovered, they're only taken out of that position or that situation, and there's still a lot of work to do on the survivor's part. And so it's not fair to say they were rescued like everything's all better, because it's not. There's still a lot of work to do as far as trauma and recovery goes. But I think the best thing you can do is talk to each individual person and ask them what they're comfortable with, because even in the survivor community, what I'm okay with, somebody else may not be okay with, because everybody's different.
Those are great points. And I love your point about rethinking our rescue language or even our rescue mentality, that's very much being addressed. That, and in fact, as I think probably almost all of us in the field know, that rescue's not one moment in time, and that it's also wrong to even think of it in terms of, a rescuer coming in, taking somebody away from a bad situation, and that's it. There we go. Wasn't that simple? And I think we'll ask Dr. Toal, would you have more that you would want to add to that as well? I know you have some thoughts just too about how services also need to be long-term, just thinking about the term rescue.
I would definitely echo Savannah's comments about survivor, and that's really key, because we want to make sure that we're not placing blame, or a sense of you're responsible for the things that have happened to you in your life. That's such a common occurrence with survivors. I mean, I've been in group with women, and they say, well, I wanted the drugs, and so therefore I was there, so therefore it's my fault. And my response always is, I don't care whether you wanted the drugs or not. That's a separate issue from the trafficking experience. That may have been a way to force and coerce individuals into being trafficked. That's a huge part of it. But the fact that you were using has nothing to do with the responsibility that you may have. I think the other side too is to recognize from a helping profession that we are the helping profession. We're, I think, staying away from therapists and doctors and this and that. So we're here to assist and support you in your journey, what I like to call your journey towards wholeness. The restoration, perhaps maybe it was a life you never had because you may have been, neglected and abused and trafficked from a very early age. So you never had that life that all of us deserve, or you lost that experience because of the trafficking. Let's return you to that level of life that all of us so richly deserve. So the language that we use is that of support. We're here to support you. We're a part of your team that helps you move along that journey towards wholeness, so that they see themselves, survivors see themselves as an equal partner in that process. Then we're not doing it to them, we're doing things with them. And I think that that's an empowering statement, because so often survivors have lost their power. It's been taken away. They've been controlled through any number of means. And so we want to restore that sense of individual identity and power for them to make decisions. Particularly in a treatment setting, there are, just like the law, there are rules. And if you're a residential setting, then, curfews and bedtimes and this and that and the other. And we threw all of those away with our short-term residential treatment to say, this is a unique experience. So, typically in a residential setting, it's like, well, if you're not in bed by 10 o'clock, the staff's coming around and saying, you got to get to your bedroom. Survivor who's had a very different kind of experience, who may work all night long, maybe she can't sleep at 2 o'clock in the morning. So maybe she doesn't need to be in bed at 2 o'clock. Let's stop reprimanding her and challenging her and putting her on contracts. So that whole language and behavior around support and advocacy and assistance and empowerment, I think, are really key.
Thank you. A great clinician's perspective there. Celeste, would you have thoughts to add to that as a direct service provider as well, what you've seen or learned?
Well, not much. I mean, everything what they said, I would piggyback. I loved what Savannah said about instead of rescued, that they're recovered, because again, that's saying that they are victims and we don't know where they are at that time. I was in court recently, and this is being very careful about how we word and how we say, and the judge mistakenly had made a comment that that she was a trafficking survivor. We were looking for safe homes, and she doesn't identify as a trafficking victim, and became very upset, left the courtroom. So again, we have to be very careful about saying, that they're victims. And like Savannah was saying, is having that conversation. And sometimes it may be getting that information maybe to the judge. Let's be careful what we say, and attorneys, and before we're saying trafficking victims. And again, that once they identify, we say survivors. But I also like the journey. Everything Dr. Toal said was journey to restoration. And it's important that they know you're there just to support them. We're not delegating things and, and that we're just there for support and to try to make them whole.
Yeah, great observation there. I've noticed, especially in working with male trafficking survivors, and now I'm talking foreign labor trafficking survivors, the language was so crucial there as well. I remember this was a number of years back, being asked by the FBI to interview an indigenous farm worker who's from Guatemala down in South Florida. He'd been exploited in labor trafficking in the fields near Immokalee, and wouldn't talk to law enforcement, but I was asked, will you go in as a human rights and an immigration advocate to talk to him? And I made the mistake of basically sort of presuming the language of being a victim. And he corrected me. He says, oh, no, I'm not a victim. And then he went on to tell me in Spanish that being worked 60 hours a week and only being paid $1 an hour and only being fed once a day, and we had to sleep on a concrete floor, and the traffickers would, he actually used the word jefes, the bosses would wake us up at 4 a.m. by kicking us in the face with steel-tipped boots. His face was covered with welts and bruises, but he would not use the word victim. And in fact, when I even tried to talk to him about human trafficking, he said, oh, that wasn't human trafficking. That was just a really shitty job. And I told him, well, jobs that are that shitty where they beat you, they don't feed you, they don't pay you, we call it human trafficking. But I understood suddenly that's a foreign concept, as is the term victim. So now, especially when working with foreign national male survivors of labor trafficking, we talk about that boss ripped you off. He stole from you. We don't use the language of victimization or of human trafficking. It's foreign language. So again, my own learning curve in terms of how do I deal with particular types of survivors in the field can be very, very important. Celeste, if I could go back to you to kind of transition to our next area. We talked about the language of how about that's important, but the approach is also equally important. And the hallmark of the anti-trafficking field in Florida and nationwide has been victim-centered services. How would you define that particular term, and why is it so important in our anti-trafficking work?
Thank you. Well, I think first and foremost, it would be protecting their legal right to be treated with fairness, with dignity and respect. First and foremost, and we know, they have history and trauma, so it's very difficult for these survivors, victims, to build any trust. So obviously, first and foremost is, for these lawyers is, and as Dr. Toal noted, we know in these legal cases, a lot of times, time is of essence, and this is hard because building trust takes time. So that's what we run into many times. Like he said, there's legal deadlines, there's a lot of things. But I think being open and very straightforward, just providing transparency, predictability, making sure that, they know what's to come. You're very straightforward. You're not saying something that you're not absolutely sure is going to happen. But I think letting them know a preview of what's to come, what's to happen with their legal case. Make sometimes milestones, decisions that they know what's coming up. Create routines. If you're meeting with them, try to meet with them. I know a lot of, the youth I work with, and who are victims of trauma, they routine is very crucial a lot of times. Also reliability, being very reliable as the lawyer. If you're saying let's meet Friday, but I can't meet Friday, I think it's very important that for sure, especially with this population, that you're able to meet with them, because you're just another person that broke a promise, and they're used to this. So I know for me, myself, even if I know, my verbiage, I always say, I'm going to try to see you Friday. Let's hope to see each other on Friday, just because I can't, I never want to break any promises, especially with this population. I try to be very routine. So I think, again, that's just and that they know that you're there being proactive and support. So trying to align with other agencies as a lawyer, whoever, try to reach out to whoever has worked with these youth. If it's a mental health professional, try to get, again, I know it's difficult, and as lawyers, they have lots of cases, but I think that's important too. If they've been working with Success for Kids, or they've worked with another mental health professional, that input is very important for you to work with your client. So I know a lot of our lawyers are very good here in Hillsborough County, and they are very collaborative with a lot of the services that are working with the youth. But again, I think that's very important that these youth know that you're aligned, and you're working for their best interest, and you are listening to their voice. Because regardless of whether they identify as a survivor, they want to be heard, and they want to know that they're being heard, and that their voice counts. So that's
Absolutely. And let's turn to our local expert, Savannah. As a survivor, what would you tell us as a legal community? What do we need to know about survivor-centered services, whether it's your personal experience or your experience just of working with survivors statewide and nationwide?
Yeah, I would say the same thing that Celeste said, with like not making promises that you're not going to fulfill. Consistency is key in building a relationship and trust with a survivor. And even from my own experience, if somebody told me that they were going to do something and didn't, like, I would automatically write that person off, even up until just a few years ago. And then also preparing them for what's to come, even if it's a ways down the road. It's very important to be open and transparent with them about what's coming up in the process and what that looks like, so that they have time to prepare themselves and other people can help them prepare as well.
Yeah, thank you. And it's that survivor perspective that we need at the table. And whether it's language, whether it's understanding about what do survivors need, let's ask survivors. That's why there's such an important part. It's my great hope that we'll actually have a survivor added to our Human Trafficking Council, our statewide council, that survivor's voice, I believe, is so important to the policy world as well. But
when it's starting to be included more, but it's still left out a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, and it's one that we still really, really need to have.
Yes.
Let me ask Dr. Toal, as a clinician with decades of experience, what are some of your observations about, again, a survivor-centered approach? And I think you started us in that direction with your previous comments about moving beyond a rescue mentality. What are some of the other things that you've learned that you would like legal professionals to know, as we may work in a number of different capacities with survivors of trafficking?
So in the field of behavioral health, we talk about that person-centered treatment, in this case, person-centered services. And Savannah made this point today, and she makes it whenever I hear her speak. I know she's making this point. Every survivor's different. Every survivor's individual. The circumstances of their experience are across the board, a full continuum. And unless we're asking them and assessing what their needs are, we don't really have an idea. Because to Celeste's point, trust is vital in engaging survivors in care. And that's the most difficult, at least I say, and I think many working in the field would agree, engaging survivors in services is very, very difficult for a very good reason. Common sense would say your trust has been so violated, why would you ever trust again? That's dangerous to trust again. In the most heinous of all experiences, human trafficking has violated every sense of trust in anybody. So common sense would say, don't move into that territory. So if I engage the survivor where he or she is at, what are your needs? What is your understanding? What's your perspective? Also understanding that some of that, and we're going to talk about trauma a little bit later, some of that's going to be distorted because of the brain changes that take place with trauma. And so to assume, and out of all my years of experience, this is what things look like. So from a legal standpoint, here's your standard kind of case, here's your standard kind of client. Our trafficking survivors are not standard. And so understanding and asking, and Savannah says this all the time, ask the survivor, what is it that they need? And then that trust piece, once you step through that door, consistency around trust. And in our treatment facility, I even talk about, standard shifts so that the survivor knows who's coming in Monday through Friday on the second shift. Am I going to see familiar face? When someone calls out sick and I have to slip someone else in there, that's a problematic. If I don't have a consistent scheduling, that's problematic because it's working against that trust. And trust is essential and vital. Trust and instilling hope are absolutely key. Those are the ingredients we must have in working with survivors. The installation of hope that life can be better. So from a legal side of it, the attorneys working with survivors need to have that installation of hope, that together working in a treatment setting, I like to say the client's the head of the treatment team. The client is the head of the treatment team, where the rest of us are here to support you in that process. So let me ask and let me evaluate and let me, allow, because some of the things that they may want, well, that's not the highest priority. Well, you know what? It may be at this moment in that effort to engage them in care and to recognize that there is light on the other side, and that I am going to be able to move through this experience.
That's a great summary as well. I love what you also said about, letting the survivor be the head of the treatment team. That makes worlds of sense. It's interesting that for those of us that work in the legal field, that's not in general the approach that we're schooled in. We're schooled in this idea that we know the law and here's what you need to know, or here's what you need to do. This paradigm gets turned on its head when we think about how is it that we actually have to work with our survivors. You also mentioned, Dr. Toal, and this is a great segue into this next really important part of our conversation, the experience of so many of our survivors being highly traumatized and the experience of trauma. Now, I know, and this was years ago when I worked with survivors of torture in Chile, we didn't have the language or the knowledge even of trauma that we do now. It is part of our neuroscience, it's part of every clinician's world. Those of us in the law field, we're not trained on it. Those of us, it's not part of our law school training. And yet we're also out there, whether we're prosecutors or working in the guardian ad litem world, working in victim advocacy, it's not something that we're prepared for in our law school training. Tell us more about what is trauma? What do you want legal professionals to know about trauma and its impact on trafficking survivors?
Absolutely. Number one, literature would suggest that at least 70% of all adults have experienced at least one major trauma in their lives. And I, using a little bit of humor, would like to say, if you ever lived through a pandemic, you experienced trauma. So after a chuckle or two to recognize we've all been traumatized in the last 2 or 3 years. But so trauma is a person's emotional response to a distressing experience. Few people go through life without experiencing trauma. And that may be, like coming, on I-4 here in Orlando, an automobile accident that resulted in a fatality that was pretty gruesome. It may be experiencing or witnessing domestic violence in the home. In the field of behavioral health care has evaluated trauma so closely now in our assessment. It's in every one of our assessment tools. Have you experienced trauma? And then beyond that, it's no longer, did you experience trauma yourself? Did you perhaps witness trauma? So again, if you were a victim of domestic violence, that's trauma. If you grew up in a home with domestic violence and you viewed a parent being beaten by the other, or mother being beaten by a boyfriend, you were also traumatized to the same degree, maybe even more so, as a witness to the trauma, not even experiencing it directly. Now, the essential key here that attorneys really need to understand in working with their survivors is that the brain changes with trauma. So there's 3 areas of the brain that are directly impacted by trauma, and that's true for all of us. But when we talk about a survivor, understand the extensive amount of trauma and the heinous degree of trauma. And I like to use the numbers, not because they feel good, but because they don't at all, but they're real. And when we understand the impact, so if you had a survivor who was trafficked, had 5 johns a night, and that's a very conservative number. It's greater than that typically. But let's say 5 johns a night and he or she was trafficked for a year. They experienced 1,825 sexual assaults in 1 year. If she has more like 10, which is typical, or he or she, then it's over 3,600 sexual assaults in 1 year. If she's trafficked longer than that, 5 years, it's over 12,000. If she's trafficked 10 years, and we know survivors have been trafficked for 10 or more years, it's over 40,000 sexual assaults. Now, we all know a person who's been sexually assaulted one time and how difficult it is for them to overcome, if they ever do, that one sexual assault. Now take a look at 1,800, 5,000, 12,000 times. How does one ever wrap their head around that kind of trauma? And so it's key. And the intensity and the complexity and the frequency of those traumas are cumulative. So it's not like, oh, you're trafficked, so it's this experience of 5 years of trafficking is one trauma. It's not. And so when we talk about the brain changing, so the first area is that fight or flight freeze experience, the amygdala, deep in the brain, that controls our experience of life and death understanding. So fight or flight, we perceive the situation to be life or death, and it may very well be a real life and death experience. And so, and I may be, again, saying something that is pretty obvious, but sometimes it's important to say the obvious, that human trafficking is life-threatening. Many survivors are not able to be pulled out of the life before they're dead. You know, one statistic is that if they're not pulled out of the life, you know, and there's an intervention within 7 years, they may be dead. And so that's key, because traffickers murder their survivors. You know, they may get so ill because they've not got medical care that they may die as a result of that illness. So that fight or flight experience is real in the life of the survivor, that this is a life or death situation. It's also could be a perception of life-threatening experience. So when that brain changes, so I'll use our example of our program. You know, if the staff asks the client, it's time for your medication, can you go to the medication room? And they react in a violent or horrific way, not because they're bad people or because they don't want services. The brain changed. So the simplest, most benign of experiences is then perceived as life-threatening and dangerous, and so they're going to have a corresponding response. So when an attorney is questioning their survivor around information and data and facts, or merely asking for, you know, what we believe to be non-consequential information, there may be a reaction, you know, that escalates very high. And then we don't understand that. And that puts, you know, we want to put up a wall when we're working with survivors, because it may be a very difficult situation, not a pretty one, but it's not their fault because the brain changed. The second area in the midbrain is that emotional regulation. So my feeling is not equal to the circumstance. The brain changed. So the tech on the unit asked me to make my bed, and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs, like you just asked me to, you know, rob a bank. The brain changed. So that emotional regulation. So again, from an attorney standpoint, you know, are we surprised by the reaction we get from the client? And our tendency is to reject when it gets loud, when it gets volatile, when it looks like they're rejecting. I'm not just here to help you. I'm just here to help you. I just want. And they don't respond like it's help because the brain changed. And no matter how hard they try, they can't change the brain faster than the brain's going to heal. The third area is the frontal cortex, the prefrontal lobes, where reason, decision-making, judgment, impulse control, and mood are. Sounds like our adolescence, right? The brain doesn't stop forming until age 28 now, is what research says. But when we talk about trauma, that area of the brain is impacted. So when we expect a survivor to make a good decision about her care, or about whether she's going to return to a trafficker, or whether she's going to take medication, or whether she's even going to cooperate, in the prosecution of her trafficker or his trafficker, those decisions are difficult because the brain changed. And I keep emphasizing that. So we can will it away. We can wish and promise and hope that it's going to change. The brain changed. 2 to 3 years out of the experience of the trauma. And so again, when we talk about trafficking, this overwhelming, unimaginable level of trauma, 2 to 3 years for the survivor, for the brain to heal. That's true for any trauma, but very significantly true for survivors. So I made the point earlier, this is not brief care. This is not brief care. So we think, oh, you got a managed care insurance and you get 26 behavioral health care visits a year. Not enough. It's not paying for residential treatment. Not enough. They may need detox because they may have had a problem, substance use disorder. The traffickers often use substances, and those substances that become physically dependent. Because if you're opiate dependent and you need it because you're physically dependent, you're going to stay with me because I'm the provider of your drugs. And so we can coerce them in those ways. So it's not brief treatment. So patience, understanding, consistency on the part of the lawyer that's providing the care, and that being present, to Celeste's point, being present is really key. And so when I understand, and my own staff argue with, and they struggle. There are very few people trained in human trafficking, particularly from a healthcare side, and it sounds like, Terry, even fewer in the legal side, to say, if I'm going to step up to the plate to assist a survivor, I need to be present the entire time. And some may say, I can't do this work because it's too overwhelming, and many do. But if you're going to choose to do the work, you've got to be present and understand the brain has changed, and no matter how much money, time, energy, and will they have, the brain will not change faster than it can through the healing process.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Toal. Walk us through, as legal professionals too, what are the indicators of trauma? And in particular, if you talk about dissociation, because that I think is such a significant part of our survivors' response to trauma, but what are the ways that our survivors are going to experience trauma, and where might our legal professionals actually see that?
And disassociation in the behavioral healthcare field, we would see as a very serious symptom. We take that, oh my gosh, this person really has some issues, but also recognize disassociation is a survival skill of people who are experiencing, trauma, particularly from a sexual and physical, that we withdraw from our conscious awareness because that may be the only way that they're able to survive. I've had survivors tell me, that my trafficker who had me down on the floor, his hands around my neck, and I really believed I was going to die. And then I saw myself outside, and so that's a disassociation. Helping individuals receive the professional services they need through that experience is really key. So, attorneys can, again, be that caring, trusted individual who is inspiring and instilling hope in the survivor, but to recognize and support that it does take a village to assist in the survivor, but it needs to be a village that is responsible and consistent and reliable, to Celeste's word. And so recognize the need for services, which may include medication. Survivors experience, certainly most every survivor, if not all, have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. So diagnosable illness, depression, anxiety. There may be a more serious mental illness that may even have been a pre-morbid diagnosis prior to the trafficking, but got exacerbated because of the stress. So medications may be key, and other forms of treatment that are really essential for them to move, across that journey to wholeness.
And in trainings that we do for our judges and prosecutors, we try to introduce them to some of the language and the concepts of trauma, but in particular, how they may see it in a courtroom, that a survivor may not be able to chronologically detail everything in the order that we would hope or expect them to do, especially on the witness stand. There may be what we call trauma bonding with that trafficker. Say a word, if you would, especially about the trauma bonding and how that can impact a survivor's willingness or even ability to, say, confront a trafficker, say on a witness stand.
And in recognizing the way in which traffickers groom their, the survivors, because, they don't walk up and they don't walk up and say, hey, Celeste, I'm going to traffic you. Why don't you come along with me? That doesn't happen. But they insert themselves into the lives of the individual, become familiar to them. But we also know 56% of those trafficked are trafficked by family or people they know well. 56%. So there's this trust or expected trust that already exists. So we don't think to question, your mother trafficked you, your grandfather trafficked you. Oh no, those of us that with a typical experience can't even believe that your mother or your grandfather would ever traffic you, but it happens all of the time. So in this piece of understanding how we can engage them, so there that level of ability to share the story and to guide them in sharing the story in the way it happens. That trauma bonding is, I'm the only, it's that brainwashing kind of thing. I'm the only one that loves you. Your mother doesn't love you. Look what she's done to you. Let me take care of you. We love each other, and no one's going to love you like I love you. No one can love you like I love you. And then gifts and those kinds of things. So if she's already here, she's already experiencing a vulnerability of self-doubt and low self-esteem and neglect and abuse. Then of course we're going to gravitate towards people who look like they're going to care for us and take care of us. So that's the first message that the trafficker gives the survivor. It's not like, oh, come along again, I'm going to traffic you right away. It's gradual. When I say gradual, it doesn't take long, but they don't start out trafficking you. It's, let me bring you along. I care about you. I love you. Survivors say, he's my soulmate. He's the person I want to be with. And so that does change, and that's a struggle in getting them to engage in services, and it's difficult for the helping profession, and certainly I'm sure attorneys feel the same way, to say, I've done all this work and we spent all this time, and then she went right back to the trafficker. That happens because, again, the brain's changed, and so that reason, decision making, and impulse control. So when I'm feeling unsafe, even in a treatment environment, even in a legal environment, then I'm going to go back to what I know was, what I believe was to be safe. And that's what they do. They believe that it's safe because that's what's happened with the changes. As far as from the legal standpoint, what can we be doing is whenever possible to, again, be that present, but also slow the process down. And because it is building trust over time and always sending the same and consistent message. I'm here for you. And I can take what you've got to say over here. I can allow you to scream at me and think I'm the world's worst attorney on the planet, but I'm not going to be rejecting you.
Those are great observations. Let me ask Savannah, speaking on behalf of our survivor community, what helps our survivors move beyond these really, really horrific experiences of trauma that you have survived, that other, fellow members of our survivor community have had to live through? What helps you?
I think the most important thing to remember is that it takes a lot of time. It's going to take years, and a lot of it's a lifetime that things come up that you have to work through. And so while you're going through this legal process, you haven't even begun to work through all the trauma that has happened. But one of the things that helps us is just consistency, going to, well, of course it's different for everybody, but going to therapy. One of the most beneficial things for me was actually something that I didn't want to do, which was go to a support group for survivors of sexual assault. And I ended up going because that's what my therapist recommended. And it ended up being the thing that helped me the most, because I was able to see that the things that I felt were so wrong with me were normal for what I had experienced. And I built the bond with these ladies, and we're still friends now, which is almost 10 years later since we met. But then also having people, like I remember I always did know somebody who had been through something similar to me and was doing well, because I didn't think it was possible. I felt like I didn't have a future that was any different than anybody else in my family, because that was all that I knew. And so I think it's important to have mentors for survivors after they've been trafficked, and have of course, obviously the resources that they need, but just a community of people, because it takes a lot of different people and resources for survivors to do well and to thrive.
Thank you. Those are great insights for all of us in the legal world to travel forward on. Celeste, thinking about the work that you do with survivors, specifically in the courtroom, or as they have to navigate their way through the legal system, as a service provider, what are some of the ways that you have seen trauma impact the survivors that you work with? And what have been some of the really important things that you very consciously do as a service provider in response to that?
Well, I wanted to definitely add, especially when we were talking about a village and providing services, and obviously we want to make sure these services are trauma-based and the provider is familiar with providing or trauma-based services. I think it's extremely important, as we noted before, to involve the survivor in these services. I've seen where, that we have a survivor, she was victimized by males, and we gave her a male provider, and she didn't want that, and I think it's important to have that conversation involving whether it's a male or female that's going to be providing services, whether, I think we get really wrapped up and, involve the people that are busy, and we're throwing services and throwing too many services. Sometimes we're throwing not appropriate services. So I think it's very important that everybody's kind of on the same page, and obviously that gets difficult when there's multiple parties working. But again, I think that it's very key that we're providing appropriate services, but we're also engaging the youth, letting them know that we're making this referral, letting them know, hey, would you prefer a female or male, or does it matter? Because again, that could be that we hear the word trigger, but that can be a trigger for somebody. So again, I think it's very important that we let these youth know, because a lot of times I see somebody came to see me and it's not their case manager, but they're going, I guess she said she's a counselor, but nobody told them that they're being referred to services. Nobody involved them. So even though it may be part of their legal case that they need to go get substance abuse treatment, I think it's very important for everybody to have that conversation with them. Hey, we need to refer you. You need to be referred to substance abuse. This is what it's going to look like. Someone's going to come out, or you need to go there, or it's going to be a virtual session. So again, and those providers, especially with this population, a lot of times, we have our therapist on hand, and they try to do a very regular scheduled session. So, weekly, we're going to meet same time on Wednesdays. But again, I think it's crucial that, we know services work. But again, if we want compliance from this population that is used to not trusting, that we're involving them to let them know that they, even though they may be mandated by their probation, or they may be, this is part of the court or whatever, at least they feel they have some say, and that will help engage them and help them trust a little bit more. But if we're giving them, that's part of their being a survivor, is giving them a little bit, and you're showing that you're allowing them to be involved in the process of their own care, because but that's what I wanted to address that. Again, I think, as we know, providing these appropriate services work, especially once we need to get them involved at the onset, involved in therapy. But again, to make sure it works is letting them have a voice, and however small that is, even if it's that small little bit of, hey, would be the best time for somebody to meet with you. So that's what I would say.
Good, thank you. As a final topic, and I think maybe take only about 5 minutes to do this, I'd like to go around and ask everybody this. We have a whole, what I presume is maybe a diverse group of legal professionals on this call. It may be attorney ad litem attorneys, it could be legal aid, it could be prosecutors, folks working in the civil law area. We've talked about what attorneys don't know, what we need to know better. If everybody could just take a minute or two to tell us, what are promising practices that you've seen attorneys engage in? What are the good things, and what are examples of promising practices for attorneys as we engage also with you all as fellow professionals in our anti-trafficking community? Celeste, let me start with you, since it's kind of a nice segue from what you just mentioned. What are attorneys doing well? What do we need to keep doing?
Again, like I said, some of our attorneys and guardian ad litems are excellent in involving the service providers. Sometimes, they're sending out referrals at the onset and trying to engage service providers, and being very trauma informed. So that's I've seen a lot of our attorneys be very careful with the language. Again, they're saying survivors. So, and again, same thing is being careful with labeling as a trafficking victim. So I have seen that, and kind of a multidisciplinary approach. I see attorneys wanting to join staffings and wanting to hear input from all the service providers, which I'm hopeful. So that's it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Dr. Toal, as a clinician, what would be your thoughts on promising practices? What are examples of what attorneys in my world are doing well?
And you made the point earlier that, attorneys sometimes, and many professionals do this, move in and say, well, I know the law, and therefore I'm going to tell you what needs to be done. And that's not going to work effectively. But what I've seen, particularly from the clinical perspective, is a growing understanding on the part of the attorneys and the legal profession that human trafficking exists, and that it's a traumatic, heinous experience in the life of the survivor. And then beginning to take a look at the whole person. So very often the trafficker, the survivor has been involved with the law. So there's going to be some anxiety and distrust of the legal system, even their own attorney, because they've had problems with the law. They may have been arrested because of not just sexual, potential view as prostitution when we know it's not, but other crimes that may have occurred that their traffickers forced them to engage in. So they may have other charges too. So seeing that collective piece, and then also helping to get rid of, one of the things that's a heavy burden for survivors in particular is paying court fines. So they may be out of jail, but because they still had a standing charge because they're over the age of 18, now there's court fines, but they can't work because of the trauma. They're in the midst of working, their clinical interventions and restoration of their life. So they can't work, but here the court fines are adding up. Then they may get a violation of probation because of the court fines. So understanding the whole picture of the survivor and what their needs are collectively and not just isolated from the legal perspective. And also, I think the understanding that substance use is a huge part of trafficking. And so often, mental health is pretty low on the totem pole as far as, there's still stigma, and it's getting better. It's much better than it was 40 years ago when I started, but it's getting better. Substance use is even lower because we still want to blame, the user for their substance use disorder. Well, if you were just stronger, you wouldn't. And so understanding that that's an element of the trauma and an element that exists for a reason in the life of the survivor then helps us see the whole person, and looking past the human trafficking piece to who's sitting in this chair across from me as a whole person. And my responsibility and requirement is that I address the individual as a whole person.
That's a great thought. Absolutely. A great reminder for us that works well and should work even better in our legal interactions there. Save the last question for the most important person on our panel, Savannah, our survivor. From the perspective of the survivor community, what are the attorney practices that are working well? What do you want to see duplicated and even more of?
Well, I've seen a lot of attorneys and guardian ad litems do a good job at building relationships with survivors that goes far beyond just the attorney-client relationship. Several lawyers have remained in contact with the survivors throughout their journey and have watched them do well. I actually have a guardian ad litem from when I was 14 in foster care who is still very much a part of my life today, and has been she's played a big role in my life. She was at my high school graduation instead of my mother. And I've seen it's been good for not only the legal professionals, but also the survivors who have that person who's helped them be a consistent person in their life and just to be able to share the good things with.
Okay, great, thank you. Again, the survivors' voice is so crucial to this conversation and beyond here in Florida. What we want to do now, we've got some time, and I think Alexis and Robin Metcalf-Blank will assist us. Are there questions that have already come to us through the chat box that we can respond to? And I know at least a few of us may be able to even stay longer for that conversation as well. But Alexis or Robin, questions that have been posed to us as a panel?
Absolutely. And I also emailed that to you all, the 2 questions that came in, just if it's helpful for you to also read them via email. But the first question that came in is from an immigration attorney with Legal Aid Service of Collier County. And this person asked, do you have any ideas on how we can better improve our outreach to assist survivors of these crimes? We would like more community members, especially in Collier County, to know that we offer these legal services to survivors of labor and sex trafficking. So it's an outreach question, whoever wants to take it.
I would be curious how they handle their MDTs in Collier County. I don't know how that happens when a human trafficking report comes into the hotline. I would be curious. I don't believe that's Sheriff's Department. I believe that's DCF. So I would maybe reach out. I'm not sure if anybody else has a better answer, but I would be curious who handles the MDT staffings, and maybe you can reach out to them and as a provider and let them know, because that's where a lot of times when a human trafficking report comes into the hotline, there will be an MDT staffing. And that's when a lot of these referrals get passed out, I guess, for lack of a better term. So that's how that occurs here in Hillsborough County. Anytime a human trafficking report comes into the hotline, if they plan on closing the report, not substantiated or verified, we have a staffing which I sit in on. If there's any providers that have been working with the youth, they tend to sit on that staffing. The CPI is on that staffing. If law enforcement was involved, they try to get law enforcement in on the staffing. And then a decision is made about referrals for the survivor. So that is my first thought as far as providers, maybe reach out to the agency, the local agency who does the MDT staffings.
And my dog is barking as soon as I have to ask the follow-up to this, but there is a follow-up to that. Would that be with CBC Children's Network of Southwest Florida?
Yes.
Thank you very much. My dog is very invigorated by our conversation. I even have on my door that says, please don't knock.
No knock.
And so I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say on that topic. You know, what you were saying got me thinking too about just always those community partnerships. You know, sometimes the last person anybody wants to call, you know, of course, the law enforcement, but also, you know, you don't want to talk to a lawyer, right? That's not the first person and many times that you call. So, you know, I was thinking it might be also good advice to just reach out to any other community organizations that don't do the legal aspect of it and see how you can create sort of a symbiotic relationship where, you know, pending confidentiality and making sure consent and all of that stuff is paramount, but maybe somehow setting that up. Any other thoughts on that one?
Well, and I always say education is huge with outreach. You know, and I know I can get pretty passionate about the subject, and I'll be speaking to someone and I'll be talking about things, and suddenly I look over and they've got this look on their face like, okay, Phil, I'm on overload. And that's okay. And to me, and I'll stop at that point. But repetitive education, the only way we're going to eradicate human trafficking is that each and every one of us recognizes the signs and symptoms, and that we, more importantly, recognize how is it that we can help and make sure that that help is consistent. And, you know, and to Savannah's point, stay in the life of the survivor. That it's not 2 or 3 years after the trauma's healed, the brain's healed, doesn't mean that their lives are completely back to what they deserve or what they need to be. And so that consistent support and care over time, it will change over time, but helping the community see the importance. I mean, I can't tell you, and Savannah and Celeste probably have had the same experience. Oh, that's not happening in our neighborhood. That doesn't happen to our children. That's not happening. I even had and I won't mention their name, I did a presentation for the NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, and a congressman said, well, that can't be American women. That just had to be foreigners. I'm like, wow, where have you been? And so that consistent message and ongoing education, every opportunity that we get it, is going to be key in outreach.
Absolutely, great point.
And some quick thoughts too. This has been one of the questions that we've kind of faced statewide. How in particular can we better get at labor trafficking, especially when it's in our agricultural sector? And in terms of outreach, who are the stakeholders that can bring these cases to us? And as you mentioned, it's most likely not law enforcement. That's maybe the last group that many of our survivors in the agricultural sector would reach out to, but our faith-based groups. It's our faith-based groups that have been the initial reporters of a number of labor trafficking cases in the agricultural sector. Think too, well, first of all, to put in a pitch for our local task forces and coalitions that do try to bring together the varied stakeholders within a community that not just provide services, but maybe the ones to identify cases. And I'm thinking of trainings that have been done around the state for stakeholders within, if we want to call it, agricultural sectors of Florida. And that could be Coca-Cola drivers, it could be Amazon drivers, it could be Uber, it could be anybody that may have access to that sector, which is in many ways a little bit removed from kind of the mainstream of Florida. Immigrant advocacy groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers have famously been the initial reporters of a number of these labor trafficking cases, and they've also been critical in providing care and assistance. I'd be delighted to follow up with who posed this question, and it's a conversation I'd love to have with you and maybe explore some of the resources that are there in South Florida that might be helpful for you. So yeah, great question.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And I'm glad you gave a shout out to the Immokalee Coalition. I was going to look it up and put it in the chat. I'll also put that in there with the follow-up materials of the recording and the CLE. So the second question that we have, and while it's being answered, I'm going to drop the CLE code into the chat. I know folks might have to head off, and that CLE code is 2210763, N as in Nancy. Again, that's 2210763, N as in Nancy. I will put it in the chat, so don't you worry, you will get it. But the second question that came in through the chat was a question kind of political, about political sort of opinion and how things are being affected by certain politicians that we know. Do you think recent political stunts by Governor DeSantis and Abbott in Texas will impact the fight against human trafficking, human rights violations, namely, as an example, the asylum seekers that were shipped to Martha's Vineyard with the promise of housing, and obviously is not an example of treating vulnerable populations with dignity and respect. So I don't know who wants to take this question or how you want to answer, but the floor is yours.
Well, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that. These survivors and these victims, they're in our communities, so that I know there's an awful lot of political conversation and directives and all. At times we have to keep our eyes on the prize, which is working with our survivors. And it can especially mean young foreign nationals. I know that there's been a great deal of political discourse about them, but they're here. And as professionals, whether we're DCF or whether we're working in the private field or the public field, yeah, we work with them on a case-by-case basis. And just important to keep, I think, in mind, what's the greater tradition that the United States has? It's of welcoming immigrants and especially working with survivors, victims. So yeah, it's important for us to keep our eyes on the prize, and I think at times not get pulled in necessarily into the political polemics, but just to understand that, especially legal professionals, we have a legal duty of care to so many of these survivors of trafficking. That should in fact be our guiding light.
Absolutely. And I know Dr. Toal does have a hard stop at 1:30, so I don't know if there was something you wanted to say on that note, Dr. Toal, or anything that you wanted to say before you sign off. Good. Okay. Anyone else on that, the political conversation? All right. And so something else did come up in the chat just now while we have a few more minutes. Someone said, I feel so ignorant on this subject. Do you think it would be helpful to educate the overall public on all of the points that you made? I think that we would all agree that education to everyone everywhere about this is important. And I would also say, there's different levels of people on this webinar, from people who are getting into human trafficking work, prevention work, to those who have been doing it for a long time. So do not feel ignorant. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're learning, the fact that you're interested.
And a good place to start would be go to the Florida Alliance to End Human Trafficking website and view that 1-hour training document, that 1-hour training module. It's excellent, and it's a good place to start, although I greatly appreciate the desire to learn more. And I agree with you, as much as we can touch every life in our country to educate, that would be awesome. But that's a good place to start.
That's a great pitch. I actually will include that with the follow-up email with the recording in the CLE. I will include the link to that that training as well, because it is extremely helpful. And Robin, just put the link into the chat for anybody that's looking to learn more and take that particular training. So 1 minute left. What do we want to cover?
Let me put in a pitch too. The Office of the Attorney General is about to put forward a training specifically for victim advocates. It's in response to a law that passed about 1.5 years ago that would create a privilege for those advocates who are working in the field, but who aren't necessarily lawyers or, let's see, clinicians or folks that would already have a professional privilege that would ensure the confidentiality of communications with survivors. So the Attorney General's office is going to be putting out this training, and it's meant for victim advocates of different stripes. Could be with our faith-based communities, folks working, say, in a service organization. It could be a safe harbor shelter. They don't have the professional credential that already provides some kind of confidentiality for communications. Upon completion of this course, it will provide that for them. So that's another great, I think, endeavor, again, coming forth from our Office of the Attorney General, and will be available hopefully by late spring.
And how can we be updated on that to make sure I can disseminate that too to our community? So just follow up on the website, or is there a listserv I can sign up for?
Absolutely. And it's in the process now. They're pulling together the trainers and the curriculum. And I believe the hope is to have it available maybe as early as this coming summer. It would be offered 3 or 4 times a year in different places around Florida. So it's specifically meant to be for folks who are advocates, but again, who in their interactions, they need to have communications that are confidential with our survivor community. So I think another real important step forward for Florida. But again, not available right now, but hopefully will be maybe in another 3 or 4 months.
Okay, awesome. And I know Robin just put into the chat. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Toal. You have to head off. Thank you so much for being here with us. It was amazing. I think Robin from Florida Alliance put in not only the link to the training that Dr. Toal mentioned, but also the CLE credit that goes along with that training. So that is also in the chat. But don't worry, I will send everything to you in an email. It'll come from Zoom, not my email address. So if you don't get it, just reach out to me. It might go in your spam box, but I'll put all of this information in a more organized fashion outside of the chat for everyone that wants to access it. So with that being said, we're rounding 1:30. I know Savannah has to be off at 1:42. 1:40 also, not 1:42. And so I don't know if I can turn it over. I think Terry does a much better job at moderating or speaking than I do. So I can turn it over to you to give any closing remarks, and Celeste and Savannah, if there is anything you want to say before we sign off.
Good. Didn't know if there were any final thoughts or questions that folks would want to share with us. I think, again, not all of us have a hard stop time, but yeah, if there's anything that we can answer.
I don't see anything else in the chat that has come through. I will keep monitoring it as we proceed to closing to see if anything else comes through. There are definitely a lot of thank yous, great webinars. I've also received some emails already from folks saying thank you so much for this training. So all I see left is accolades.
Well, it's a great thing to go forward on, that engaging our legal professionals here in Florida in the variety of capacities that they actually already serve in. They have a dog in the fight. There are clearly parts of our anti-trafficking response, whether you are, again, a prosecutor, an attorney ad litem, working in legal aid. Very, very happy to actually also follow up personally, Coonan at fsu.edu for anything that would be helpful that way.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to include your email as well, and that follows a follow-up material so folks can reach out to you. There's also a shout out for the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence in the chat, a great organization that works with folks who survive sexual violence. And with that, Celeste and Savannah, anything else? Nope, good. I know you all have talked enough. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Like I said, when I opened up this discussion, I'm honored to share this platform, not only with the amazing audience that we have, but really you all as presenters and speakers. I'm in awe of the work that you do. I wish I were strong enough and smart enough to do it too, maybe one day. And I appreciate all that you bring forward and bring to the table. And again, thank you for participating in our training series and really tying it with that beautiful bow to finish the conversation of January, but continue the conversation throughout the rest of our lives.
Thank you.
You're
Thanks,
very welcome.
everybody.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye now.